All right, looks like we're now live. Good afternoon to everyone who's starting to join us. We're going to pause a little bit before we launch into the meat of the discussion and let other participants join. So just give me a moment and we'll kick off here in a minute.
I did one of these the other day, Becky, and it was for a conference, and the moderator person she decided to basically play our podcast intro music, like
Nice.
for this whole awkward wait for people to join thing, and she didn't tell me it was doing it, so it's kind of cool.
That's a great idea. We might consider doing something fun like that in the future. And for our guests who are joining us tonight, I was letting Kevin know that the weather outside is absolutely lovely. And we may have some participants swayed to be hiking out there in the sunshine while it's still lasting. But we'll give everybody just a couple more minutes here and then we'll get started. Well, I think I'm going to launch into the formal script. I suspect folks that have been following the Housing and Health Speaker Series have heard some of this before. So in order to save on our time and not be too redundant, we'll just get going. My name is Becky Gray, and I'm welcoming you to the continuing Housing and Health Speaker Series. I serve Chaffee County as the Director of Housing, and this afternoon I get the pleasure of being your host for this event to discuss infrastructure and the costs associated with maintaining it. This speaker series began over a year ago, and we've enjoyed hearing from experts on a variety of topics. And today, as I mentioned, we're poised to hear a discussion about the costs that are associated with infrastructure, not only its installation, but also its long-term maintenance. So I'm so glad to see you all joining us this afternoon. The Housing and Health Speaker Series is funded through Colorado's Health Disparities Grant Program. It's being administered jointly by the Office of Housing and the Department of Public Health. There's many connections between housing stability and the health of our community, and this program is intended in part to highlight those connections and the policies that influence them. I want to give a shout out to the team of remarkable people that have been working to put these events together here in Chaffee County. So a big warm public thank you to Andrea Karlstrom, Lisa Martin, Heather Gorby, Dale Shoemaker, and Janie Hayes, who make up the Housing and Health team and have been instrumental in the execution of these events. Thank you, team. Thank you for bringing such joy to a pandemic lifestyle in Chaffee County. If you have not checked out the Housing and Health website yet, please do. You will find recordings of past speaker series events, links to upcoming events, video stories of Chaffee County residents and their experience with housing insecurity, a Housing 101 booklet that's full of definitions, as well as information on advocacy efforts and how you can participate in advocating for affordable housing development in Chaffee County. The website URL is housinghealthchaffee.org. I'd like to offer you some housekeeping details about today's event and point out some features of Zoom that we're going to be using if you haven't used them yet. As audience members, you're all muted, which simply means that if you talk, we won't be able to hear you. However, we do want to field any questions you have about this topic, so we're going to use the Q&A feature. So located at the bottom of your screen, you should see a QA button. And if you have questions now or anytime during the presentation, just click on the button and type in your message, hit enter, and the questions will come to me. After our guest has finished his presentation, I'll ask the questions on your behalf. So jump on in the discussion and ask away. The second feature that we're going to use is this online polling. I have an abbreviated poll for you today. We're going to measure our community's growth in understanding the topics that we're talking about. So you should see a poll on the screen in front of you, and I invite you to answer the question that you see. We use this poll and the answers that you provide us to meet our grant requirements, where we are working to increase our capacity of understanding these topics. And in appreciation for your participation, you are eligible to receive a Chaffee County Discovery Pass, which, if you don't know, is a discount card that will save you close to $800 on food and drink and shopping and adventures here in our wonderful community. So it's a great opportunity to play tourist at home and support your community while we're entering into a winter like we've never seen before. So when you registered for this event, you should have received an email that had a purchase code for the Discovery Pass. So please don't forget to take advantage of that great opportunity. So I am going to stop the poll right now and share the results with you all. We have a pretty broad spectrum of understanding on our audience members here today. So thank you so much for that feedback. Now on for the main event. So I'm really pleased to announce that Kevin Shepard has accepted my invitation to return to Chaffee County in a virtual realm this time for this important conversation. Some of you may remember Kevin from his visit back in 2019, when he and Monty Anderson joined us at several different locations around Chaffee County and led several conversations about incremental development. And we touched on this topic at that time, but I invited Kevin to come back and take a deeper dive. If you missed those great events, you can find a recording on housinghealthchaffee.org. You can also hear a couple interviews with Kevin, one of which included Monty Anderson, and I think I pitched in a little bit, jumped in there, on the Chaffee Housing Report, which is a KHEN radio show hosted by Ken Matthews and John Prey. The podcasts to the shows can be found on KHEN's website, which is easy to find on the Google machine. Kevin Shepard has over 25 years of experience in civil engineering, planning, and site development, as well as municipal finance. In 2011, he founded Verdunity to provide people and resource-focused planning and engineering solutions to progressive cities and developers seeking to move beyond business as usual. Known for his innovative ideas and willingness to challenge the status quo, Kevin enjoys educating others on fiscal and environmental impacts of various development patterns, and he thrives in environments where multiple perspectives must be brought together. He is a vocal advocate for the nonprofit group Strong Towns, which some of you may have remembered Chuck Marone visiting us prior to the pandemic. Kevin serves on the board of the North Texas chapter of the Congress for New Urbanism, and he writes and speaks regularly on the topics of fiscally based planning, small-scale development, economic gardening, and neighborhood revitalization. You can learn more and find his podcast show called Go Cultivate at www.verdunity.com. So without further ado, Kevin, welcome to virtual Chaffee County.
Thank you, Becky. Let me get this. Okay, we good? Give me a thumbs up if you can see the screen. Sweet. Well, thank you for that great introduction, Becky. I appreciate it. I wish I could be there in person. This is the time of the year. I'm based here in Dallas, Texas, and this is the time of the year where we just have the cruddy weather. It's kind of fallish, but it'll go from like 70 degrees and just kind of humid to 30 degrees and a little icy, but not cold enough to really be fun. And so I know when I came there last time, it was the first time I had seen snow for that year. But usually I rely on my trips and my travel to get out and get to enjoy the scenery and the weather changes around the country. And I've just been stuck here in Texas for most of this year doing the Zoom thing. So, but I was excited when Becky reached back out to me and said she wanted to dig into this topic of infrastructure funding a little bit deeper. If I were there in person, you guys would be getting business cards from me. I love to pass out cards and talk with folks to keep the conversation going. A lot of times when I do talks, people that hear it, it takes a little while for some of this stuff to sink in, and then they have questions later on. And so I would encourage you guys, if you hear something tonight and you want to follow up with me, you can give me a phone call, shoot me an email, catch me on Twitter or Facebook or any of those places as well. So let's dig in. So I know this topic, the title that Becky had given it, that's a crazy sexy title for a presentation: infrastructure funding and maintenance, and how we're going to pay for it. I don't remember exactly how it was written, but I want you to think about your community right now, and when you look around, do you feel like your community has enough money to pay for basic services and infrastructure, for the public safety needs that you have, for infrastructure maintenance, street, water, sewer, et cetera? Do you feel like your community has what it needs to pay the bills and maybe invest in some quality of life type projects? If I could see you in person, I would be looking at your responses. But usually when I give this in person to groups, most of the folks will say they don't have enough. There's usually, and it's usually streets that comes up as the first kind of issue of that people want to talk about. But think further out. Think not just today, but what about 10 years from now? What about 20 years from now? When your city, when some of maybe the newer development starts to age, do you feel like you have the money then to take care and continue to serve your community? And I'll come back to that in a second. I've been asking this question of city managers, mayors, elected officials around the country for at least the last 10 years, maybe more. When it comes to growth and development in your community, what's the biggest challenge or frustration that you've been dealing with? The overwhelming majority of folks will answer with some version of this: how do we keep up with the growing or increasing wants and needs of our residents with limited resources? So how do you address the quality of life, the rec centers, the parks, the trails, the amenities that people want? But at the same time, you've got to take care of those streets and the water and aging neighborhoods as well. And you have to do it in this environment where there's a real challenge with raising taxes or worrying about property values or state income taxes or what have you. And so our city leaders are in a really tough spot of how do you balance these two? So I'm gonna back up a little bit and tell you a little bit about my story as an engineer turned planner turned community consultant. This is kind of what I've been called lately. I started out my career as a civil engineer, where we were taught growth is good, expansion is good. When we are building new stuff, that is bringing more people to a community, more jobs to a community, and more tax revenue and more wealth to a community. In general, growth is a good thing. So I was working as what we called at the time a municipal civil engineer. So I would do site development, a lot of municipal infrastructure, streets, drainage, water, sewer type projects. As my career progressed a little bit, I got to work on some larger scale transportation projects. One of which was that image you see there on the right, the Hoover Dam bypass project. I was lucky enough as a young engineer to get to spend basically what amounted to 2 weeks a month in Vegas working on this project, and then I would get to come home for 2 weeks and go back and forth. And as a single guy, it was pretty awesome to get to do that. But it was fun to work on those kind of larger infrastructure projects at the time. Around 2009, I got offered the opportunity to interview for my former firm's national director of community planning position. This was right after the 2008 recession. It was right as the stimulus program was rolling out, and our planning program was kind of in a weird place because a lot of the money for typical planning projects had been scaled back, but there was also this opportunity to figure out how to use some of the stimulus money and a lot of sustainability focused monies and grants at the time to help communities. And so I interviewed for that position. I didn't think as an engineer, I was like, why would an engineer get a planning director position? But I ended up getting the job. and went from a world of kind of my just my engineering world there in or here in Texas to working with community planners, urban designers, urban planners, economists, landscape architects. It was kind of a hodgepodge group, but what they focused on was land use planning, sustainability, downtown plans, um, and so I got to travel around the country, see a lot of different cities of shapes and sizes, and big cities, small cities, and at the same time help them work through this post-recession recovery, I guess. And it was just a really interesting time in my head of just seeing different things that forced me to challenge what I was taught and what I always thought was true. Um, so I'd be traveling around and working in places like a Detroit, like a Chicago, East Coast, West Coast, and then I would come back to North Texas, where we really didn't see much impact from the recession. Things really didn't slow down for us too much, and so there was this dynamic of just grow, 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 the race for all of the communities, the suburban communities, especially to be the best place to live, work, and play. And you started to hear more cities when you looked at their plans. There was just this almost an obsession with pursuing fast growth, higher quality of life. We've got to have these amenities so that we can recruit and retain businesses and residents. There was just it was all about growth, and we weren't considering or fully considering the long-term impacts, whether that was fiscal impacts, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about, environmental impacts, and now even there's social impacts to the way that we've been developing as well. So there was this mentality of growth is good, growing faster is good. In Texas, it was, we're doing everything bigger and better and even faster. But this was true in a lot of parts of the country of just the approach to development in general. But what about maintenance after growth? And this is the other side of what I saw in traveling the country, is places that were no longer growing, no longer had the revenue from new growth and from incoming, new business or new residential growth. And just so many places were struggling to take care of what they would build, what they had built. They were struggling to take care of the neighborhoods. And when you can't take care of infrastructure, especially streets and water and sewer, the core infrastructure that we depend on, when you can't maintain that as a city, the neighborhoods are going to start to decline. The property values will start to flatten out, and eventually the people that live there are going to start to sell, move somewhere else, and you start this cycle of decline. And I saw that in a lot of places as well. So back then, kind of 2000, this was maybe into 2010 at this point. I was having this conversation of well, we've been building this way, and when you look at older communities, it ends up with this track or down this path of how are we going to maintain this. And I was asking, what are we doing differently in our newer communities that's going to keep them from ending up in this same place? And the answer is we really aren't. We really aren't doing anything different. We're doing the same things, and especially in Texas at that time, we were doing it bigger and better and faster. This is about the time that I reached out to Chuck Marone and from Strong Towns, and we've been friends ever since that first conversation. I thought it was just going to be a quick, hey, how are you doing? Can you answer a couple questions? And we ended up talking for a couple of hours and have talked and collaborated on a lot of things since. Um, but I'm going to focus more specifically on this talk on the infrastructure situation, infrastructure resource gap, as I like to call it, and the relationship that it has to our development patterns. This is just a slide from San Diego that shows 1.86 billion in infrastructure needs over the next 5 years. So I mean, think about that, guys. 1.6 billion in infrastructure needs over 5 years. And then the second part of that that sentence there in the middle, with no concrete plan to pay for them. We see this over and over and over in cities of just huge infrastructure deficits and nowhere near enough money to pay for them. This is another slide from Macomb County in Michigan. This is the county road and bridge director that's saying it was going to take them 2.3 billion with a B to fix all of the county maintained roads and bridges in poor condition. So this wasn't all of the roads and bridges in the county. This was just the portion of the roads and bridges that were in poor condition. And we've done a lot of infrastructure assessments across the country, and just over and over and over, you see huge, huge funding gaps and funding needs. And one of the things as an engineer that's been frustrating to me is just see this dialogue over and over that we need more money, whether it's at the federal level, the state DOT level, a county, or a city. A lot of the engineers take is, well, there's nothing wrong with the way that we're designing and building things. We just need more money to fix it. Well, what if that money's not there? And so this was really the question that I kind of settled on, and what I continue to ask today is, with all of the growth and prosperity that we've had in this country, why do our cities struggle to pay for basic services and maintenance? And you might say, you might have answered that question where I started, of saying, yeah, Salida, Poncha Springs, BV, we have enough, we're doing well. But that second part of, do you have enough 10 or 20 or 30 years from now, is really what you need to be thinking about. One of the things that has kind of created this resource gap, that has led to us having this large amount of infrastructure to replace, and the lack of funds to do so, is our development pattern. This is a slide from Victoria, Texas, one of the communities that we've done some modeling work with. And I just like it because it's a good, clean map that kind of illustrates the concept I'm going to talk about. You can see kind of in the core of the map there, the dark green, that is the kind of the core, the oldest part of the city. That was the original historic town square and the original neighborhoods around it. And then when you look kind of outside of that, you see kind of the yellow, the orange, and the red. That is post 1950, so post World War II development, where the invention of the automobile, the kind of the shift to the suburban, kind of more of the, for lack of a better term, the suburban sprawling type development pattern, where what happened, and just to talk from Victoria's numbers, from 1950 to 2015, so 65 years, their service footprint, or the area of the city, grew by over 13 times, while their population only grew by 4 times. So pre-World War II, we were developing, and if you saw Chuck Maroon's presentation, if you've seen any of Strongtown's content, he talks a lot about the historic development pattern, where we built things more incrementally. We would build in that traditional grid pattern, and then as we needed to, as more people came and the demand and the resources were there, we would expand our cities incrementally out, incrementally up, and incrementally more intense, meaning that we would extend out a couple more blocks. We would add a second or a third story to our buildings, and kind of the core of our city, our core downtown, would become more intense in terms of, that's kind of the wealthiest part of your community. And then as you work your way out, it starts to spread out a little bit. But nowhere during that time did we go issue debt, did we do a bunch of crazy, really restrictive zoning codes or anything like that. It was all just building a little bit at a time, based on what people wanted, what people needed, and most importantly, what we had the resources and the local wealth to build. Post World War II, that model flipped, and we were able to start to buy and access land a lot cheaper, and a lot more quickly. We were able to start to get loans, whether they're federal or housing loans, different loans and funding programs were out there. And so you started to see us build things in a much more spread out pattern, and a lot faster, without the population there to continue to fill it in at the same kind of density as we were doing before. Why do I tell you this in terms of infrastructure? Well, when we build things spread out, that requires more water lines, more sewer lines, more drainage system, more water towers, more police and fire, more fire stations if you want to maintain the same response time. So you're adding more facilities, more streets and roadway network to maintain. You're adding all of these things to the city, to the local government or the county that they have to take care of. But again, you're spreading that density, you're spreading those people out. And so you have more costs, but you have fewer people or fewer households to pay for those costs. And so just straight up numbers, the cost per household goes up, right? But it really doesn't do that because of our policies and our budgets, the way we set them. We tend to keep the cost per household at kind of a flat rate. And so when you do that over time, you start to see a funding gap or a resource gap emerge. Um, this is another chart that describes what Chuck Marone from Strong Towns calls the illusion of wealth. I just sometimes call it the best place to, or the best place to live, work, play phase. But if it start over at the left side of the chart here, where you're a small community, a small population, you've built your kind of main street or your downtown square, you have a few neighborhoods around it, and it stays that way for a while. It's a small town. This is how most, if not all, of our communities across the country have started. Um, as you work to the right of that chart, your infrastructure is older. You kind of have that the core part of town that has some older buildings, older neighborhoods, older streets. And then you hit your growth phase. So then the market kind of comes to you. There's a demand for growth. The developers want to build new residential development. You have demand for more commercial development. And so you see this growth period where there's lots of new infrastructure built. There's new parks, libraries, schools, all of the things that come with growth in a short amount of time. So your community's population goes up, and the average age of your infrastructure, and really as your city overall, goes down, right? Because you're building so much new stuff in a short amount of time that you have more new than you do old. In your community. And so during this phase, this is where so many of our suburban communities today are. I think you guys, to an extent, are in this phase as well, with so much demand of folks to move there, where you look around and it all looks good. There's affluent folks, wealthy folks there. The parks are well maintained. The schools are doing well. The buildings are in good condition. You've got a lot of different businesses, competing or looking to come to your community. But the hidden bogey there is, let's continue to push to the right here. And as your community ages, as you start to run out of land to develop, whether that means you're just physically can't develop anymore, maybe you're landlocked, or it just gets so expensive to build, to build and make the math work. Either way, you start to hit kind of a build out, or at least a place where you can't expand outward anymore. When that happens, your revenue from new growth, the revenue from new development fees, revenues from additional residential or commercial growth, that starts to flatten out, right? And at the same time, what you see is all of that infrastructure that was put in by developers 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 years ago during your growth phase, and even the older stuff that was the original part of your community, all of that infrastructure has now extended past its life cycle, and it's you can no longer just kind of patch it and do preventative maintenance. You have to replace it, and that's where so many of our cities are starting to get today. Of our growth slows down, the wealth starts to flatten out, and the infrastructure maintenance wave just absolutely overwhelms us with all of the streets and water and sewer and drainage that we need to fix, and we just haven't been saving the money to be ready for it. So Chuck describes it like this. I like this quote. I think it sums it up well, and I'm going to unpack this a little bit in the next few slides. But Chuck says, our core problem is the lack of financial productivity in our development pattern, brought about by the negative return on investment from our public infrastructure projects. Very wordy, but what does he mean by negative return on investment from our public infrastructure projects? Well, we think when we put infrastructure in, a lot of folks will describe infrastructure as this is an investment. This is an asset. We as a city are going to build a road, put a water line in, a sewer line. That's an asset to us because that's opening up growth. When in fact, that infrastructure, as soon as you put it in the ground, it becomes a liability. It becomes then something that the city and the taxpayers are on the hook to maintain and take care of in perpetuity. The developer puts it in up front. Yes, they do. Sometimes in different places, we have different funding structures that will offer them incentives. Sometimes there's impact fees or other fees that help collect some revenue to pay for that upfront infrastructure. But the maintenance on the back end usually comes out down to the taxpayers, and whether that's property tax, sales tax, a street fee. There's different combinations to get at it, but you as the resident are paying for that in some way. So to just explain kind of this negative return on investment that Chuck is describing, I'm going to show you a couple of street examples. This first one, the cost of the project here was a little over $1 million. It was an asphalt street, so they were expecting to get 25 to 30 years of life out of the roadway. And these are property tax examples. We've also done some of these with sales tax revenue, but property tax is the cleanest and easiest way to illustrate this concept. So the cost of the project is $1 million bucks, going to last 25 to 30 years. The property tax revenue that this community was getting from properties that were being served by this street was a little under $18,000 a year. So if 100% of that property tax revenue went to nothing but this street, it would take 58 years to pay it off, which is around 2 times the life of the project. So we're making this investment, this $1 million investment as taxpayers or as a city in a street. It's going to last for 30 years, but it's going to take us 60 years to pay it off. And that's if 100% of property tax revenue goes towards that street. Nowhere, I've never seen a city anywhere that puts anywhere near 100% of their property tax revenue towards streets. It's usually 3%, 5%, maybe 10%. Sometimes you have a supplemental street fee or something, but even when you lump all of those funding sources together, it's nowhere near close enough to pay for these street investments. Here's another one, same kind of concept, $875,000 project. This one, it was going to take 65 years to pay off the investment, or over 3 times the life of the project. We have examples like this from all different cities, different tax structures, different property values, and in most cases, they really these street projects struggle to pay off, just in terms of the adjacent revenue around it to recoup the cost of that street. So if the revenue from the properties around that street or being served by that street can't pay for it, then where do we get that money from? Well, we talk about sales tax. We talk about other revenue sources in the community. Well, but we also have police, fire, parks, libraries, water, sewer, drainage, administration. we have all kinds of other things that our communities have to pay for as well, that those revenue sources have to contribute to as well. So I think at the core of a lot of this, when you think about cities and development, we start with land. We have land in our city. That's really the most important resource, most valuable resource our cities have. And once we develop that land, when we put infrastructure to serve that land, the idea is that development is going to generate enough wealth in our community to pay off that investment. Otherwise, why are we building the infrastructure? Why are we building and developing that land in the first place? So when you look at this citywide and you add up the streets that we've built across an entire community, one of the exercises that we'll do is say, if your city had to replace all of the streets that it has right now, and not preventative maintenance, not just patching potholes or chip seal or something like that, but when it comes time to replace the street, what would that cost? And in this community, we looked at it, we added it all up, and it came. Gotta move my picture up there. It came out to 124 million was the total price tag for this community. If most of these were asphalt streets, so when you average it out over 20 years, that came out to a little over $6 million a year. They were spending in their current budget, they were spending 1.7 a year. So, and these are just very high level numbers. It doesn't get into inflation and some of those types of things. It's just a quick number, a really quick way to say, if we had to replace everything, what would it cost, and how does that compare to what we're spending now? This community had a $4.5 million deficit, but they do have a pretty good distribution of their of their street condition, of kind of serious or poor condition to good condition. So at least it's a fairly equitable kind of distribution between the streets that are need to be replaced now and what is further out in the future. Some other places that we've looked at are not in anywhere near as good a shape as this one. They have much more of their infrastructure is much older and needs to be replaced sooner. And so their gaps, not only are their gaps as big or bigger, but they have more liabilities that are due sooner. So they have less time to figure out how to close that gap. This is a quote from a city manager that we worked with that I think represents how at least kind of the shift that I hope a lot of city leaders can make. She said most city managers understand that they have a resource gap, but when it's not quantified and shared publicly, it's easy to defer to next year. Once you put a number to it and you see how large that number is, it creates an ethical obligation and an urgency to address it immediately. In her community, they had an infrastructure of street gap of just 144 million. Um, there's others that we've worked with that have been over a billion, 1.2, 1.3 billion. I'm gonna show you an example of one community that was 1.2 or 1.3 here in a little bit. And this is just streets. This isn't talking about water and sewer and drainage. This is just street infrastructure. Um, so let me actually, before I go further, let me just kind of pause here for a second, talk about a couple of the different ways that infrastructure can get paid for those of you that maybe don't dig into infrastructure as much as maybe engineers or planners might. There are water and sewer are typically done or funded by something called an enterprise fund. So those are things where you have utility bills. It's in some way, it's based on usage. So when you use a certain amount of water, you pay a bill. Those are separate funds where the revenue from that goes specifically back to water and sewer. You see the same kind of thing maybe for sanitation, for wastewater collection and or for waste collection, waste management in some places. Um, Streets, on the other hand, tend to be paid for from the general fund. So this could be property tax, it could be sales tax, it could be a street fee. There's a number of different ways that gets paid for, but usually it comes out of a city's general fund. Um, and so that's, it's harder to, I guess, take a street and do something like an enterprise fund where it's usage based. There's some different ways happen around the country that we've seen street assessment fees. We've seen just kind of a stormwater utility fee used for drainage funds. But in general, I would say that we're starting to see more communities, especially older ones that are really up against this resource gap, come up with new ways to try to capture additional revenue to get at this underlying issue of we're not generating enough from our development pattern to pay for these things. So we have to have some other fees to catch up. So who's willing and able to pay to close this gap? If our taxpayers, if residents are tapped out, whether it's we just can't, property values are going up too fast, or we don't want to see a property tax rate hike. If our taxpayers can't or won't pay more, and our cities lack the funds needed to cover the basic services, what should we do? How do we close the gap? A lot of cities and states have some kind of revenue cap, a property tax cap, or a cap on income tax. There's different dynamics there, and from state to state as well, that we have to look into. But again, just kind of this general conversation of, we have more needs than we have revenue coming in. How do we close this gap? And so often it's, it does come down to the tax rate, and what can we do with adjusting the tax rate to close this gap, or maybe we can add a fee here or there. But I would come back to the willingness and ability to pay. I think a larger and larger portion of people across the country don't have the resources to pay more. If anything, they're getting to a place that they have to pay less. And that kind of connects to some of Becky's other affordable housing initiatives that she's talked about as well. But there's an opportunity here. There's actually something that we can do that doesn't involve raising the tax rate, that doesn't involve additional fees. And that has to do with our development pattern. Um, so this is simplified, but these are kind of the three options that I'll present with the communities we're working in to close the resource gap. The first one is you keep your development patterns and your service levels where they are. You keep doing the exact same thing that you're doing, but you're going to charge more, higher taxes and fees to cover the costs. Nobody likes that. Citizens don't like it. Developers are going to say they don't want to be charged more, that they can't make their math work. Nobody wants to pay more. The second option is we keep our tax rate and our fee structure where it is, but we cut services to align with the revenues. This is what most communities do today. We have a certain amount of revenue coming in. We match our budget to that. And anything that we can't cover with that budget just gets deferred to the next year, and then to the next year, and then to the next year. If you look at a capital improvement program, we see this in cities all over the place, where you'll do your needs assessment and you come up with 100 million or 200 million, whatever the number is, of needs that you have, and you only have a certain amount of revenue within your current fund structure, or maybe you're going to do a bond election or a bond program to pay for some of that, but you only can afford to do a portion of it. So that other 80 or 90% you can't do gets deferred to a future year or a future program. Well, what we see happen is when you come back the next year or another 5 years to do it, not only has that list of is that list of what you deferred still there, but it's grown. You've added more. There's even more to maintain, because of what I was talking about earlier, of older development, that more and more is coming online that needs to be replaced. We're not seeing very many places where that gap is going down. So the third option is where I like to focus the conversation, and this is, what can we do to shift our development pattern and our infrastructure design? Maybe think something as simple as the width of our streets. Just changing the width of our streets can have a big impact on the cost. But what can we do to shift our development pattern and our infrastructure design to enable a more affordable balance of services and taxes, not just for today, but over time? So I feel like our goal in our communities, and the work that we do with presentations like this, and the analysis work that we do, is trying to provide data and a language to community leaders and to citizens, so that you can work to align your development pattern and your service levels with what your residents there are willing and able to pay for now and in the future. So what does that look like? I mentioned a common language. I think fiscal sustainability is a common language that everyone could connect to. When you can put development decisions and things like density and roadway, transportation, traffic, when you can put some of these things in terms of what it's going to mean to the city's revenue, what it's going to mean to liabilities and costs, and ultimately what it's going to mean to the taxpayer and what they're going to have to pay in terms of taxes or other fees, you'll see more people lean into this conversation. And so it does give us a way to kind of have a common language to talk about these things, to talk about common problems, and then work towards common solutions that benefit the community, that benefit taxpayers, but that also are workable from the private developer side as well. One of the tools that we use to help move this conversation forward is land use fiscal analysis, or land use and infrastructure fiscal analysis. We want to help you find ways to quantify and communicate your resource gap. When we talk with people inside cities, they'll usually understand this. They usually understand that, especially public works directors, engineers, that they know that there's kind of mounting liabilities that are there that need to be addressed. If you talk to folks on the planning side, they know that certain development patterns can be better in terms of revenue generation, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. But we need to find a way that we can connect engineering and planning and the budget and different developer interests all into a way that citizens can understand as well. So this is what the land use fiscal analysis looks like. We will start with property tax revenue per acre. If you're a community that's got property and sales tax together, we can look at that as well. Property tax is the cleanest because we can map that down to the parcel level. So we start by taking the actual property tax revenue that's generated on each parcel in a community, and we divide it by the size of the parcel, and you get a revenue per acre number. That allows you to just do a quick look and say, well, based on an apples to apples comparison of just the revenue per acre generated by all of the development in our city, you can see which ones are lower, which ones are higher. That's different than just saying the total value of a property is X without really considering the size of the land that it is taken up in the community. So the revenue per acre metric gives us a way to factor in the amount of land that they're using with the revenue that it's generating. The second step that we take is to look at the current budget. And so we'll take, when a city does its budget, they take the revenue that they have coming in and they match their budget to that. And anything they don't have revenue to cover gets, like I mentioned earlier, gets deferred. So with this step, we take that budget and what a city is currently working with, and we allocate that back down to the parcels. And you basically get a profit and loss map for the city. So it shows for every parcel, every property in the city, which ones with current budget, at least, which ones are bringing in more revenue than they cost to serve, and which ones are costing more to serve than they're bringing in. You want diversity there. Every city has diversity of some uses and development patterns are doing really well, some aren't. But in most cases, we have way too many that are in the red and not enough that are not enough that are positive. And again, that's why we end up with the deficits that we have. But that's just current budget. The third step, and for an infrastructure conversation, this is the most important step, is to look at what's unfunded. What are these unfunded street liabilities? Could be water and sewer, could be drainage, parks. There's other things that a city knows that it needs. There's other kind of liabilities out there that they know they're going to need to address if they want to maintain quality of life, if they want to maintain and preserve property values. So we look and we get those as well. And then so we work those into the model. And so this is really turns out to be, what do you really need? So step 2 shows kind of what you have. This step 3 shows what do you really need. And what we see in so many models here is this is where a lot of development patterns go far, not just red, but well into the red. And it sometimes, a lot of time actually, is development patterns that people think are the ones that are making money for their city. So this is just a really informative exercise to go through in a community, just in terms of understanding at a basic level how your development pattern connects to your revenues and costs. To show and just explain this a little bit more, here's a couple of different development patterns that to compare side by side. On the left is 0.76 acres of a Main Street mixed use. It's not even, it's just 1 and 2 story. We're not talking a huge downtown here. We're just talking a typical 1-2 story, just very much like what you have there in Salida, BV. Just modest mixed use, historical, traditional downtown development. 0.76 acres, and that Main Street development is generating property tax revenue per acre for this community of almost $16,000 an acre. You contrast that with the one on the right, which is a suburban pad site. This is a common kind of development that a lot of communities want. And this is similar in acreage. It's pretty close to the same land footprint taken up. But this one only generates a little under 7,000 per acre to the community. A lot of that has to do with the parking. If you want to maximize revenue per acre, in a very simple way, you put more building on the ground. The more building you have on the ground, the better you're going to do. And then if you go vertical, if you have 2 stories or more, you're going to do better that way too. So anywhere you see a lot of parking, if you see a lot of open space, your revenue per acre number will go down. The exception there might be open space that's done in a way that it's an amenity or it contributes to the value of adjacent properties. But So just one quick comparison here of a Main Street mixed use to suburban pad site. You can see the difference. This zooms out a little bit. This shows a traditional grid downtown, a little over 10 acres. One of those 8 blocks is actually just nothing but civic open space. So it's not generating any kind of tax base um, for that block there, and it's generating 12, a little over 12,000 per acre for that area to the city. You contrast that with a big box that's almost double the acreage or the land footprint, and it's a third of the property tax revenue per acre to the city. This is always where I'll get the question about, well, what about sales tax? Sales tax follows the same trend. It's harder to model because you can't drill it down to a parcel level the way that we can property tax. But when we've worked with communities to do this, the same kind of concept applies, which is when you put more people in an area, you're gonna increase your property tax value per acre. You're also going to increase commercial demand for services, and so your sales tax is going to go up as well. We're working on a project right now where we're exploring. I'm working with a sales tax analysis firm, and we're comparing the sales tax revenue that a big box is getting to the same to what their Main Street businesses are getting, and just initial results is that community is getting more jobs, more sales tax, more property tax out of the Main Street than they are that big box. And unfortunately, what you see in a lot of places too is that big box is also the one getting the incentives and the tax rebates and other things to come to town or stay in town. So just in terms of thinking of it, in terms of you're a city, you have land, you're going to put infrastructure out there to develop it. Which of, when you look at those patterns, which one is a better return on that investment? It's that old traditional pattern, the way that we used to build, that you guys are actually, I said this when I was doing the talk last night, you guys are blessed there to have a lot of the right kind of development pattern in your old downtowns. Your challenge is more kind of where you're headed with some of the expansion outward. And this, I thought this is just a good community that I've had my head in lately. So you're seeing a lot of slides from Taylor, Texas, which is a small community outside of Austin, but they've got a really great core kind of gridded downtown and some neighborhoods around it. But then as you can see with this slide, that light blue area is all area in their city limits that they're talking about expanding to now. So they're having a conversation with their comprehensive planning process of, do they want to expand out? And when they put infrastructure out there, what kind of development do they need to recoup that investment? And so our fiscal analysis process is helping to inform some of those decisions. But this is what this looks like at a city level to see some real numbers and maps. This is just their revenue per acre. The dark green is the highest revenue per acre. The light blue is the lowest. And most of that area, like I mentioned, that's light blue is undeveloped right now, but they're already starting to punch infrastructure out there to serve it. So the city is already, the clock is ticking on that road or water and sewer infrastructure that 20, 40, 50 years from now, they'll have to rebuild, but there's no development out there generating revenue to the city yet. This is their net revenue per acre map for the current budget. So I mentioned we take that revenue, we take current budget costs and allocate those in, and this is where red shows up for the first time. So anything that's red is negative. So it's costing more to serve than it's bringing in revenue. If it's light blue or green, it's still positive. And you can, this is very zoomed out, but you can still see that, some of the newer development on the north side is doing, is green and doing well. Their core downtown kind of right in the middle of the kind of that red square. I don't know if you can kind of see you can't really see my cursor, but their core downtown is also dark green. It's a little hard to see at this scale, but it's also not just dark green, it's also the highest net revenue per acre, much more than the residential development up on the north side. But this is where it gets fun. This is where we go to the next map and we add in the unfunded infrastructure costs of what they really need. And when you do that, you can see a lot more of the city goes red. You go from, let's see if I can back up. You go from this one, especially if you focus kind of right in the center part of that map, you'll see a lot of light blue and light green that turns red. So this, when we do maps like this, you can start to see kind of where the opportunities and where the concerns are in terms of how different patterns are doing and what the return on that infrastructure investment to the city is. Um, this is another, this is the community I mentioned earlier that had big time infrastructure needs. This is Brownsville, Texas. It's an older community right down on the border that we modeled last year. They had $1.3 billion of street replacement. So after you take the money that they were putting towards preventative maintenance, $1.3 billion is what they needed to fix their street system, just what they had in the ground, not counting any new stuff that they were talking about, adding to their system. That came out to almost $66 million a year. And to make it worse for them, over half of their streets were in poor condition and really need to be rebuilt now. This is something that we see in a lot of the larger cities and a lot of the kind of more mature or older cities. They look similar to this. There's just massive dollars, and a lot of it is in need of replacement now, and the money's just not there. This is what their map looks like. This is a 3D version, which some people like this better. This shows their current budget. This shows when you load the street cost in. So you go from a lot of green. So if you look at what do we have right now, you feel like things are pretty good. When you go to what do we really need, it's a little bit of a different, not a little bit, significantly different picture. Some of the things that we'll do is we'll go in and look at the different development patterns of lot sizes and land uses and try to understand how they're doing. And one thing that's emerged from every model that we've done is this here, that small scale development is a win-win for the community. I'll use the phrase cultivate fiscal health and local wealth. That's what Monty and I use a lot in our presentations. The fiscal health part is the revenue per acre to the city. What you can see in this slide, if on the left-hand side, it goes from for single family lots, the smaller lots, 0.2 of an acre and smaller are on the left, and then it goes as you work to the right, it gets bigger. The green bar is revenue per acre, and so you can see the smaller lots have the highest revenue per acre, and as you work to the right, the larger lots have the lowest revenue per acre. This trend has held true in every city that we've modeled. It's not always this extreme, but in every single case, the smallest lots generate the most revenue per acre back to the city. So in terms of a fiscal health standpoint for the city, more small development can capture more revenue per acre. You don't want to do all that. You want diversity, just like you would with a personal investment portfolio. You're going to mix some things. You want to see cities do that as well. The cultivating local wealth angle comes into your residents and your businesses being able to get into affordable, whether it's an affordable home, whether it's an affordable space for a small business, and then getting in there and owning and kind of getting that equity and growing that equity over time. The small development provides an excellent opportunity to provide affordable housing, but it's affordable not because it's poor quality. It's affordable because it's a smaller scale. So you still get really high kind of rent per square foot or value per square foot, but it's just a smaller square footage. Same thing goes for commercial. It's a smaller space for a startup or for a small business to get in and get started. And then once they get going and get their business proof of concept and get it going, they can move up in spaces. But the small spaces are really a great opportunity to get revenue per acre to the city, and then also provide some of those affordable options for businesses and residences. And this is something that we did talk a little bit more about last time we were there. That's something I think you guys need to continue to look at in terms of keeping your housing prices kind of in check. So this is kind of one of the recommendations that comes out of this is when you have growing infrastructure gaps, when you can see the pattern of when you build out the additional liabilities that brings, the additional service obligations that brings to the community versus infill and that traditional pattern. when we look at a lot of cities and you do infrastructure assessments, the older parts of town, the original kind of traditional grid neighborhoods are typically where that's where your oldest infrastructure is, and that's where a lot of the streets and water and sewer um, need to be fixed first. That's also the area that has the development pattern that when it is invested in right, when you have good streets, when you have a mix of development, you don't have the blight side of development, which sometimes you see in these older neighborhoods because they've been let go, but you actually have good investment in a mix of small homes, duplexes, fourplexes, maybe some live work units. When you have that kind of investment in it, these areas around kind of the core downtown and the neighborhoods right around them can go from maybe looking red like they did in Taylor, Texas, with a little bit of with a little bit of investment, they can flip to not just have a positive ROI, but have the highest ROI in the city. So that's where we encourage communities to focus. If you want to close your resource gap, focus your infrastructure money, your economic development, maybe some of your housing strategies into the core downtown and the core neighborhoods, and see whether it's a vacant lot, maybe it's adding a second unit, maybe it's starting to add or allow another story. But do go back to the way that we did things, you know, before, pre-World War II. Go back to the traditional pattern where we added incrementally to those areas, and you can capture a lot of additional value without additional infrastructure, or with a modest additional infrastructure investment. Maybe you have to upsize a few pipes or something, but for a modest investment there, the return on that investment goes way up. So when you do that, you're taking care of old infrastructure, and at the same time, you're capturing additional value from the development pattern without having to touch the tax rate. And so when you capture that additional revenue, you can invest that back into taking care of more streets, more neighborhoods, and more infrastructure. This isn't just one example from another community, Pasadena, Texas, that we're working with. An older part of town, older neighborhoods. They've started to go back in and replace and reconstruct some of the streets. They're also coordinating some housing strategies to. They want to take care of some blighted areas. They also want to diversify some of their housing. They went in here and took some old properties. You can see on the bottom right. It was negative 4,000 an acre for three lots there, or a couple lots there. And then they worked with a developer, got a couple of those lots, redeveloped them they split it into some narrower lots, and you can see what the revenue per acre did there. You might ask, well, what about gentrification, or what are the price of those homes and who was there before? Yes, these new homes were a little bit more expensive, but not nearly as much as you would think, again, because of the size. The lots are smaller. It allows the structure to be a little bit smaller, and so the prices are a little bit more. But again, the quality that they're getting there is a significant bump up. So there's all kinds of ways you can mix and match these different kind of housing and infrastructure combinations. But the real key to it is focusing it in areas where you've got older infrastructure and have to make that investment there as well. Just to hit on a few other things related to street infrastructure in particular, streets, roads, and stroads. Strode is a term that Chuck Marone from Strong Towns coined a while back, and he calls it the futon of transportation. A futon, it tries to be a bed, tries to be a couch, and it kind of stinks at both, right? A strode is the same thing. It tries to be a street, which is a platform for wealth, a place for people, for gathering. A road is intended to be a high-speed connection between two places. A strode is kind of a street road hybrid, where it's trying to be a platform for wealth. It's trying to be, a place for people, and it's also trying to move cars and vehicles quickly between two places. But it does none of those well. If you think about a 4-lane, 5-lane roadway, median openings, traffic signals, big box or fast food stores with big parking lots on both sides, that's a strode. You can't really get anywhere quickly on those because you're constantly stopping either at lights or because people are turning in and out of driveways and medians, and it's definitely not safe for people and interaction. because of the higher speeds. So and just the sheer volume of cars. But if you just look at these two images for the same footprint of land and compare kind of what you can do here with if you focus your design and your land towards wider right of way for cars for the roads and then the parking lots, and you just look at a couple of buildings there and the value or lack of that you're recouping there, not to mention the quality of the place that you're building. Compare that to the street image where you could see there the flexibility that you have with different building types. A home can turn to a business, or a business can turn to a home. The streets, you can kind of there's just a lot more flexibility in those traditional neighborhoods. When you look at costs and you compare streets to stroads, the stroads are much more expensive to build because they're a lot wider. They're much more expensive to maintain. They take up more land footprint and right of way, which again, land is really valuable to a city. So what you choose to put on it, whether it's a parking lot or a wide road or a narrow road with buildings, is going to impact your dollars and cents in your community. You compare that again with the street. They're narrower, so they cost less to build, less to maintain. They're much more flexible to repurpose and reuse. If anybody, I don't know if we have any engineers on here, but if you've ever tried to retrofit a 5-lane thoroughfare with parking lots on both sides, you're kind of limited with with what you can do with those. And some of this is just placemaking, right? This is some of what I learned when I started working with the planners that I didn't learn in engineering school. Is in engineering school we're just thinking about designing for design speed and curve radii and visibility triangles and things like that from a driver's perspective to make it safer for drivers, versus places for people where senior citizens, a mom, their kids are comfortable walking and biking and moving around comfortably. Those tend to be the places that hold their value, that have higher value, and also tend to attract and retain more people and more generations because there's so much diversity there in the housing, the residential, and the commercial opportunities. I put this one in here to just connect it to public safety, because public safety is such a big part of our budgets. We see so many places where, especially in this country, where we're designing our streets and our neighborhoods around the large fire trucks and around response time. So we're designing wider and wider streets that are, oh, by the way, more and more expensive. And this is kind of I don't remember who said this, but they said, our wide streets allow us to respond quickly to the collisions that are caused by our wide streets. And so, if you've ever been to Europe, if even, some ski towns, even some areas of where you guys are, there's places where we've put place and people and narrower streets first, and we design our public safety fleet and system to accommodate that. So especially you see that in Europe, where they get smaller trucks and they have a different kind of response system, because they know the value of designing for people in place. So that's just an interesting dynamic that I'd like to see more cities dig into as well, because I think if we can shift the way we design our streets over time, we can start to reduce what we have to spend on public safety, fleet, and equipment as well. The last piece that Becky had mentioned that I want to just touch on briefly is just evaluating fiscal impact of new development. A lot of times, for a long time, even when I was doing work on the private side, private development side, when we would do fiscal impact analyses, whether it was a city or a pro forma for the developer, we would consider the first round of infrastructure, so putting it in up front and what that would cost. Very rarely did we consider the maintenance or the next replacing it at the next life cycle. That's something that we've been working with cities to integrate into their analysis. This is an example from a small community, Fate, Texas, which is one that we've been working with for a while now. This is a very simple assessment that they do. They look at a private to public investment ratio. So they look at the tax base that that the development is going to generate. They look at the cost of the public infrastructure, and then they do a ratio. and they also do estimated years to repay the public liabilities. This one just compares two. On the left is a small kind of mixed use project. On the right is a big suburban residential project. And you can see kind of in that red box, the private to public investment ratio for that mixed use development was 36-1. Just shows you're generating much more tax base to the community than the cost of the infrastructure liability. Um, and it was going to take under 9.5, so under 10 years to pay off the public infrastructure for that project. Compare that to the suburban residential, the private public ratio was 8-1, and the years to pay back the public liabilities was over 40. And that was actually, with some additional monies that the developer put in to try to close the gap. So Fate works with developers to do a very simple analysis like this, and they use it to just facilitate dialogue with the developer of how can we want you, developer, to build in our town, but we also don't want to take on a bad investment for our taxpayers. And so you've seen more, just more dialogue and compromise from both sides to work on the infrastructure, on where can you tweak some of the requirements for the street width or cul-de-sacs, or maybe just the density of lots, whatever it may be, to try to find a middle ground that the developer is comfortable with, and that the city is as well. They've been a lot of fun to work with, and seen how they've the Fate guys, of how they've used this to interact with developers. The second is a more robust fiscal impact analysis, where you can look at, for a development, and whether it's got just residential, commercial, and you look at everything: sales tax revenue, property tax revenue. You've got, maybe there's some other funding sources that are in there, but the big thing that we factor in that a lot of others don't is, again, what will it cost to replace the infrastructure when it reaches at the end of its life cycle, and how do we factor that into the revenue of the development to make sure that it can that the revenue brings in over that 20, 40, or 50 years, so that when it's time to pay for that infrastructure again, the money is there. And so when you can shift those investments, within your city, focus on infill, focus on existing areas with existing service and existing infrastructure, and try to capture additional revenue from that footprint first. And then when you can work with developers to try to build more fiscally sustainable development, so that it, number one, pays for itself, and then maybe number two, generates a little bit of extra that can also kind of go towards closing this gap. That's where we're trying to move communities towards. So just to wrap up with these thoughts, and then we can get into some questions. Number one, most communities have rapidly growing infrastructure liabilities that are not funded. I have yet to see a city that has money to pay for everything that they have to maintain. Number two, while developers pay to install infrastructure on the front end, many development patterns do not produce sufficient revenue to pay for the maintenance and future replacement. Number three, closing the infrastructure funding gap will take a combination, most likely in most places. It's a combination of additional fees, revisions to development policy, design standards, partnerships with public agencies, private developers, and taxpayers. We have to have a more transparent conversation in our communities about the liabilities that are out there, that we as city and local government don't have the revenue that we need to pay for it, and start to go to the community and have an honest conversation about how do you want us to close this gap, so that we don't have to let things go in the future. And that's the last one, of the land use and infrastructure fiscal analysis. We've found that to be a really powerful tool of getting people to lean into the conversation, start to build consent. You're never going to get support from everyone on a strategy, but you can start to use this to have more informed decisions about growth management, annexation, infrastructure design, housing, economic development incentives. All of those things can kind of be focused back towards how do we quantify, communicate, and close our resource gap. So with that, I'll take some questions. I'll leave this up here for a sec. These are a couple of places that you can connect with us, follow along. Becky touched on the podcast there in the middle. I would, if you guys are podcast folks, I'd love to encourage you guys to give that a listen. We've had a lot of really fun conversations on that about these kind of topics with people that do it in different places in different ways, and just again trying to just educate. So I'm going to turn the slides off and see if we've got any questions, Becky.
Kevin, thank you so much. I always love listening to conversations about this topic. I know it's a little kind of a niche for those of us that are interested, but I think you just did a really great job of explaining how these are all interrelated. Before I jump into our audience questions, I wanted to just touch on a question from that last bit of your presentation, where you talked about a community that has a fiscal impact analysis that they look at when a development's coming at them. And then you said maybe tweak things a little bit with the developers so that it's a win-win for everybody. One thing I've heard over and over again is that developers want certainty when they're approaching a community to develop, that they don't want to enter into negotiations every time. So I'm wondering if you might speak to that a little bit, and how have you seen that fiscal impact analysis and the negotiations that follow impact development in that community?
Yeah, really where this gets to is comprehensive plans and zoning codes. If you can do it on a one-off case, but you're right. I mean, developers want to be able to know what they're getting into in a community. So we've started to do more of this work as part of a city or county strategic plan, comprehensive plan, or zoning codes. Zoning codes are just a great place for this, where you can look at lot sizes and different configurations, and use the fiscal to make an argument for maybe smaller lots or some of the things that some cities are trying to go away from. But so yeah, I mean, you can do the fiscal analysis on a one-by-one cases as developers come in, but ultimately where we need to get as communities is zoning codes and comp plans, land use policy, growth management policy that is focused on this resource gap.
Well, and then it sounds like that then would require a balance of development pattern types so that we have a good balance of residential versus commercial versus mixed use, and in the right manner. So I guess to tie it back to the conversation about community planning and development codes, is that something then that a community can do cyclically as we update comprehensive plans and update codes, also look at the fiscal analysis to inform those updates?
Absolutely. I think a lot of folks will say that the budget is the most important document in a city, right? That's when all of the departments come together and they say, here's our needs, here's what we want. And ultimately you look at a budget, and that's going to tell you what are the priorities of that community. I think what this fiscal analysis does is kind of go out a level from that and out a little longer term into land use and zoning and infrastructure design, the design standards for infrastructure, but also capital improvement programs and prioritization of it. It brings all of those together so that you can see how they all work together to either increase or decrease your overall fiscal gap. I mentioned last night that the big opportunity is where I see an opportunity in a lot of places right now is look at your infrastructure condition. We're doing infrastructure assessments, engineering and public works. We're always doing that, looking what are the condition of our infrastructure, capital improvement programs. We all have economic development incentives. All communities have some kind of housing programs and community development block grants that we're doing. If you look at this through the lens of how do we close our gap, there are ways to connect those investments together and really kind of target certain areas and just get huge bang for the buck in terms of redevelopment or adding, maybe you just want to add population in an area to increase your commercial demand. So you're really getting at economic development, but you're getting at it through housing and infrastructure by just tweaking some of the, to get more density in that area. But yeah, it is really important to build diversity. You've got to have, if you want to keep I think a strong community or a vibrant community is one that can have 3 or 4 generations of a family that can live comfortably and affordably in that place. And go look around this country, and there aren't very many that do that, right?
Right.
And then if you add a layer to that and you look at lifestyles and just different price points and what people want, there's just not enough diversity out there, across the country and inside our communities. So there might be a portion of your, of your communities there that say we want big lots, we want rural estate kind of. That's great. Um, but you also have to have enough of the denser stuff to pay the bills. Or I think, another question we got into last night was just aligning the, like the fee structure. Could you do it in a way where different development patterns pay different fee structures, so that you could get them to pencil out? So maybe a more compact pattern has less taxes and fees on it because the pattern itself pays the bills, or a much more spread out pattern, people would pay more in the property values and in other fees to kind of offset the lower density.
And
So
is that a trend that you're seeing already in progress in our country, or do you kind of see that as a trend that might be on the cusp?
cusp. Some places have figured it out.
Yeah.
Some places have figured it out. Um, you know, a lot. I would put a lot of places in the category of inside city leadership. They want to go that direction, but they have to get the public on board, because the public at large is kind of comfortable with the community and the look and the feel that they're in.
Yeah.
And they don't want change. The keeping it the way it is stable, and that's what they think is going to keep property values, keep the value of their property, um,
And so
up.
that kind of ties back to a slide where you mentioned that fiscal analysis piece could be the common language that helps the community understand why the change is going to benefit them in the long run. So
Mhm.
thank you. So I want
Yeah,
to ask.
and another example too is, and this is housing and infrastructure related too, but you think about, um, just I had a conversation the other day with a community that, was kind of against density. They didn't really see the need for townhomes or apartments or some of that. Um, and I brought up an example of a person I know, who, she is a widow now, unfortunately, but she married 2 kids. We're living in a suburban community, very well entrenched, church, schools, all of that kind of stuff. Her husband got killed in a car accident, and she could not afford to stay in that home with her kids. She wanted to stay in the community. There was nowhere for her to go because that community had not built a
Yeah.
housing product that someone like that could afford, and it killed her to have to move her family out of that community. And so we don't think sometimes about, when we're talking about, affordable housing or workforce housing or some of these things, that they do matter, from that end. But also, you have a lot of folks that are ready to downsize and don't want the big yards, don't want the maintenance. And so you guys again have a place that's very attractive that a lot of people would like to be, and, especially now with COVID, are probably wanting to be even more. So the demand is going to be there to drive the prices up. So your affordability issue is just, how do you build some of that other product to just keep even the smallest things from being crazy expensive?
That's right. I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. You talked about placemaking. You gave us the word strode and told us what the difference between a strode and a street is. And then I really liked the picture where you showed the emergency response vehicles, because that wasn't necessarily a strode. It was just a very wide street. So the question is, does making streets narrow make that much difference in terms of the initial construction and the future maintenance cost? And how do you deal with parking when you start narrowing your streets?
Good question. I see that came from Ken. So, Ken, good to see you on here, again. But so street design is interesting. From the cost perspective, I'll give you just a very easy number to remember, and it varies by place. But we'll use, for concrete streets, we'll use $1 million for an 11-foot lane mile. For asphalt streets, we'll use half that. So $500,000. So 500,000 for an 11-foot wide lane a mile long. It's probably a little more expensive for you guys there. But when you think about the width of your street, um, and I'll compare in an older neighborhoods, 24 or maybe 27-foot wide streets, they tend to be narrower, versus newer neighborhoods where we have wider streets. That extra 4 or 5 or 6 feet of pavement, um, can really add up when you do that across a city. So that's one thing. They do, when you look at them, the width of the street can make a pretty significant impact. In terms of parking, parking is really tricky because um, land use and transportation and parking all go together. And when you build a pattern that is spread out and requires everyone to drive, you have to dedicate more of your land to the car, whether that's more lanes or more parking. That does not create revenue for your city. That creates nothing but liabilities. That's my more compact, more walkable places that don't require as many car trips, um, do so much better from a revenue side, because you just have more revenue generation on the land than you have costs. Um, there's a couple things, when you look at kind of the community design or an area plan or downtown, parking and drainage. Parking, drainage, open space are kind of all in the same category for me. You have to look at the individual site, but you also have to zoom out a little bit and look at it from a little bit bigger picture and say, where is the place that makes the most sense to put this open space or this regional drainage detention facility, or where is the best place to put parking? Maybe it's a few streets that have on-street parking, maybe it's a parking garage or a few parking lots, but you design it in a way that you are going to take a chunk of land somewhere and dedicate it towards that non-revenue producing use, um, but it's in a way where it serves kind of the adjacent development. So um, the other thing to talk about street design and parking is, with just with street design, especially like residential design, a lot of our newer streets are wider to accommodate the public safety. So we've got to have it wider so that if a car is parked on both sides, you can still get the fire truck through the middle. And what ends up happening is if cars aren't parked on either side, it's a very wide street and they
Mhm.
tend to be very straight and they're runways. And in today's world, you can do this on your phone and you're going 50 miles an hour down a residential street without blinking. When you narrow the streets or when you have on-street parking, it's more crowded. So as a driver, you're forced to pay attention. You're
Yeah.
forced to slow down. All the neighborhoods I grew up in were that way. There were cars parked on the street, but we could play ball in the street. We could play, we could do whatever we wanted to in the street because the cars had to drive slow. Another Just another little factoid for you: 30 miles an hour, magic number for streets. If you are a pedestrian and you're hit by a car going 30 miles an hour or less, you have an 80% chance of living. If you are hit by a car going 35 miles an hour or higher, your chances of living go down to 20%. And so many of our residential streets have a speed limit of 30 to 35 miles an hour, but people don't drive that. So um, street design, and I'm kind of chasing a rabbit here, but street design, if you want to slow cars down in a neighborhood, it's not speed bumps, it's not more stop signs, it's not more cops, it's designing the streets in a way that force drivers to slow down. So, one very cheap thing that we've done with some cities where you have wider streets, and you have parking issues and you have walkability or pedestrian safety issues is you stripe it. You add on street parking, you narrow those lanes down. Maybe in some cases, you can even use some of that extra width to add a bike lane or something. But just by doing things to add more stuff going on adjacent to the travel lanes,
Mm.
um, you know, you slow the cars down. You also, when you do things like that with the street design, that's also the kind of street frontage that is more attractive to the small incremental development, the live work unit, the kind of neighborhoods that are more, more walkable. So
And I
it's all connected.
It occurred to me last night when we had this conversation that the neighborhood you just described, that's more walkable, has better street frontage, has more transportation options, is also the neighborhood that is producing typically more revenue. And so it's healthier for the community's budget. But then go back to the human side of it, it's healthier for humans too. It's a better environment to be in when we can walk to the grocery store and we can have social connections with our neighbors. So I just want to make sure that, because it's a housing and health speaker series, that we make sure we can make that connection, that it's possible that the health of a community's financial budget in terms of infrastructure maintenance can really be linked with the overall health of the community members as well.
Well, and I think I said that to you the last time you brought us in is we, one of the things that my team has done is try to connect some of these things together, because I just early on in my career as an engineer, I didn't think about housing. I didn't think about how things were going to get paid for. I didn't think about quality of life and some of those things. But now I do. And so the more we can connect those together, the more these solutions start to make more sense. And so I said it to you last time, I'll say it to you again. I just think these kind of conversations to connect the fact that you're using, the healthy community grant to kind of bring infrastructure and incremental development and entrepreneurship and all those together. There's not a lot of people out there that think to connect those things together. So that's why I said, anything we can do to support you and what you're doing with this program, I'm all for it.
Thanks. It's been a fun adventure so far. I got another great question from Ken, and I also want to kind of blend it with a question I asked last night. Some of the communities in Chaffee County don't have any property tax. So for residential development, there's very little revenue generation. Yeah. We're currently about to wrap up a county comprehensive plan that is quite literally pushing development towards the infrastructure and towards the cities. So for a very specific example, the city of Salida, there it is. The city of Salida doesn't have a property tax. And yet we are pushing development adjacent to the city for the reasons we talked about tonight with infrastructure. And then to add a layer to that, Chaffee County hasn't accepted any new roads in a very long time. And so what kind of strategies might we look at as a community to help the HOAs that have to maintain the roads in these new developments that are happening adjacent to communities in ways that we're going to be able to pay for that infrastructure in the long term?
Whew.
Yeah.
Several parts to that question. Let me take the HOA one first, because we talked about that some last night. But I think HOAs can be a good thing if they're set up, and the responsibility is that the HOA is going to handle the maintenance of the infrastructure. That can be a good thing. The problem I see with a lot of those is they're not really accounting for the real costs of what it's going to take. And so I've seen some HOAs where it's come time for that, and they don't have near enough revenue in there to do it, and so then they do go to the city or county to ask for help. I think you don't, as I understand it, you may not have, well, yeah, all the communities there are different, but the concept of property tax, sales tax, either one, the goal is you want to generate more wealth, more revenue in your community to pay for these things, whether it goes to the state and then comes back to you in some way, or if it's property tax that goes to the county and then gets distributed to the city, or if it's sales tax. Any of those are your development pattern creates demand for commercial development, residential development, that generates the revenue. The more people you put into an area, the more revenue you're going to generate. That's the simplest way to explain it. So even if property tax is not a factor, if you're putting more people into an area, you're going to generate more demand for the residences there. You're going to generate more demand for commercial development, which drives sales tax. Your county and your state are getting revenue from these things as well. So sometimes we've had a conversation similar to this about an area, in an unincorporated, even in a property tax state, in an unincorporated area of a county outside the city. And so like, why should the county care about something like this? Well, the county gets property tax too. Or why should school districts care about something like this? Well, school districts get money from this too. So it's all just certain development patterns generate more wealth to the community. And when you have more wealth, however it finds its way back to you, it will. And I mean, I do think the property tax system is the best way to go. I'd love to see a land value tax even better, which is a different conversation. Um, but you guys are very interesting in that you have three three different communities so close together that have different funding structures, and different philosophies about land use and zoning and infrastructure and growth. Um, so I mean, it's an interesting, fascinating place. I think you do have some challenges. I know when we were there, you've got really good stuff to build on. That, I mean, if we did a model for Salida, it's going to show downtown's doing the best. I mean, and some of those neighborhoods around it. But just the conversation about expanding outward and, doing more out on the edge and more out into the county, that's just going to it's going to be so expensive to build, and it's going to just add huge, even more liabilities that you're going to have to figure out how to, how to pay for. So I think just having the conversation with the different cities together, with the residents, with the county about, and you guys there, the engineers and the folks there are going to know these numbers better than I do at this point, but look at all these things together and work together. Just again, just that common goal of just close the gap. And you're going to have different strategies for each of those cities because of the structure that you have. But I don't think anybody wants to be in a community that is heading down a path that's not going to be able to preserve and maintain things down the road.
I think you're right. And you touched on a little bit how different each of the communities we have, BV, Salida, and Poncha, but we also have unincorporated Chaffee. And our planner, John, thanks for joining us tonight, had a great question. In unincorporated Chaffee, we don't have any community public infrastructure. There's no water, there's no sewer, nothing whatsoever. And our difficulty lies with large parcels being subdivided away from any facilities or away from any opportunity to plug in. And knowing what we learned tonight, that the smaller parcels tend to generate more income, what are some suggestions for this rural area that we have?
Yeah, I mean, on the rural side, it's more the other end of the infrastructure spectrum of how can you minimize infrastructure out in those areas with maybe, you go and there's, I want to say it's Omaha, Nebraska, but they're taking a lot of roads that they had paved with asphalt at one point, and now they're taking them all back to dirt and gravel to, they're
Wow.
they're reversing, they're going backwards. But things like septic, wells, those are the kind of things that start to make sense in the rural environment. Where it gets really messy is where people want to live out in that kind of environment, but they still want the same kind of service levels that the ones in the city have, in terms of, hey, we want police and fire out here quickly if we need to call them, and we want better water pressure, or what have you. So it's more in those areas, it's more reducing the infrastructure as much as you can. And then I still think I remember the conversation a little bit with, in the kind of preparing for this, that John was mentioning that of like, there's big lots and then they're kind of being cut up into some smaller lots. I'd have to see more of that and exactly kind of how the financing behind it, works. But yeah, I mean, the most of our investment needs to go into the city proper, and it just does.
Yeah,
I don't mean that in a bad. I don't mean that in a bad way but at all. But I mean, when we're talking about infrastructure investment, usually the rural areas don't have as much, and people that move out there and live out there don't want or need.
Yeah, it really sounds like a math equation is what it boils down to, right? Input and output. So thank you for offering such a great presentation on how that math equation looks in all of its complicated forms. Very much appreciated.
We try to make it, third grade math and pretty colored pictures.
Well,
It's a
thank you once again for joining us tonight and engaging us in this great conversation. I really love learning from you. And I think that our audience had some great questions and feedback as well. This video will be recorded and I will place it on the housinghealthchafee.org website. So anybody who's with us tonight that wants to review it or share with their friends, they can certainly do it from that site.
And then we're also, I'm going to shoot you a copy of the slides too. So
wonderful. Wonderful. So we'll put that slide deck on the website as well.
Yep.
And Kevin, I hope we continue this conversation in Chaffee County to the extent that we can invite you back and really start digging into the numbers here. It would be a fun exercise to do. So thank you so much.
I'm happy to continue to be a resource for you guys.
Wonderful. Appreciate your time. Bye.
Take care.